I'm Andrea Christianson. I'm a partner in Penta's DC office and head of our firm's AI task force.
And I'm Chris Mehigan, partner at Penta Group in the Brussels office.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Intelligent Conversations. This is a recurring series that's part of Penta's What's at Stake podcast.
We're facing a time of unprecedented technological innovation in the AI space. Each month, Andrea and I are going to dissect the AI latest news and developments from each side of the Atlantic, helping you understand how AI will affect stakeholder management, policy, and more.
Let's dive in, Chris. All right, so first, happy Leap Day. Do you celebrate?
Happy which day?
Leap
29th day?
Leap Day, yeah.
Yeah, not really. Although a friend of mine got hit a couple of years ago where there's a strange tradition in Ireland, I don't know if it's elsewhere, where if you haven't asked your fiancé to marry you, that the fiancé can use Leap Day to surprise you. And this did actually happen to a friend of mine. So,
and did it end well?
Watch out for that. Oh, it ended very well. Yeah.
Well, there's a whole movie about that.
Really?
Yeah. It's called Leap Year.
Okay. I don't know if AI was involved. But
I think it takes place in Ireland. It's a rom-com. You should tune in.
Maybe a very Irish thing. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I found out today that Julius Caesar actually was the person who decided there should be a leap year every 4 years.
Yeah, the Julian calendar. Yeah.
So anyway, that's a fun little fact for our listeners today. But what we're really here to talk about is AI. And I'm going to go with you first. Anything new, fresh? What do you want to share with people? What's happening?
Well, yeah, there's been quite a lot. We're getting down to the sort of the business end of things over here in Europe. And the AI Act, which has been so much focus for so long, we're finally through the legislative process. It's been published, it's been done, and now we're into the implementation phase. The establishment of the AI office, which is an agency which is going to be required or set out within the AI Act, and is going to be there very much about the implementation. So there's been a lot of focus on that, and I think we can probably speak about some key elements of it, but really the work now is going to be on realizing the ambition of the AI Act over in Europe. But of course, some other industry news over here as well. We're continuing to see, considerable investment. Probably the biggest news was Microsoft's interest in that French startup Mistral, which really sprung onto the scene sort of, late last year and gave us a bit of excitement from a European perspective in terms of developing up a large model, which is really the first one from the European perspective that we would have. But what we're also seeing is some very interesting developments in the European space on more kind of bespoke or more kind of, niche elements in terms of where they're deploying AI and machine learning. And some of those projects are really exciting.
Awesome. Well, over here, I just listened to an interview with the CEO of Google's DeepMind. And right as I'm getting comfortable with Gen AI and all of the cool things that'll be done with it, he's talking about artificial general intelligence and that we're probably a decade away. And so I'm sort of back in this oh my God, things are changing really fast phase and trying to get my head around it. Although, he's obviously very positive and coaches a cautiously optimistic approach by folks. But that was that's kind of the newest thing over here where I'm re-grappling with the timeline of and pace of change that we're probably looking at.
Absolutely. It's an interesting topic and one we will probably see more of over here, I think, as we get into the next evolution. But like I said, here, a lot of focus has been given on the actual, now that we're finished with the text, what exactly did it say and so forth. And the big topic here, I think, that I would be pointing people towards is understanding the risk-based approach, which has been very much at the core of the European approach. But having said that, it went through some fairly significant changes during the negotiating period for the AI Act.
It'd be great for listeners here in the U.S., the biggest, as you mentioned, language models and developers are U.S.-based, Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic, all of this is here. How should they be thinking about the high-risk elements in the AI Act and what's in there that's going to affect them and what practical things do U.S. companies need to be thinking about?
It's, the AI Act is you can't help but compare it to the general data protection regulation in terms of the scope and ambition and size. And it's actually bigger when you look at the number of articles and annexes and, it does eclipse the GDPR, which is quite interesting. But there are certain similarities and there are certain approaches which are consistent between the two. And a lot of it comes down to almost to a certain degree, an element of self-regulation or self-assessment by companies in terms of bringing a product to the market. They do need to make a determination about where they fit, and the risk category is really a key aspect on this. And it comes from, there's really a sliding scale from unacceptable risk down to high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And if you fall into the low risk category, like there's very little in the AI Act that's going to concern you too much. On the unacceptable risk, obviously that's going to be a much, much bigger issue, but there's very few that fall into that. The real question is the high risk piece. And the high risk piece is something which is defined to a certain degree within the third annex, so Annex 3. So it sets out very particular areas which are automatically deemed to be high risk. And this includes things like the use of biometric systems, systems that are required for critical infrastructure, systems for education or employment, or access to essential products or essential services, whether public or private, law enforcement, immigration, and then administration of justice and so forth. So while that's a fairly comprehensive list, it is quite focused, as you can see, in certain areas. Now, having said that, although the deemed categorization for anything in that space is going to be high risk, of course, there are exceptions, and this is where you need to kind of then consider what the actual outputs are. So there are a couple of categories you can get into here, but really what you're looking at is down to whether or not the AI system performs a very narrow task, or if it's intended to improve the result of a previously completed human activity. Well, then, that could be a derogation as well. Whether or not it's intended to detect decision-making patterns. Again, so it's not making a decision, but it's rather kind of honing or enforcing a decision that's taken elsewhere. So whether the AI system is intended to perform a preparatory task to an assessment. So again, not that it's kind of acting in isolation, but rather it is supporting work done by this. So if you fall into one of these derogations, then even though you're within one of those classifications under Annex 3, you could still find that you're not deemed to be high risk. Beyond that, then, there's a second process we need to go through, and this is where companies would have to get into conducting their own impact assessment. And there will be the development of these systems. You're going to see companies coming forward with this, with, whether it's online forums or consultancy work, or even sometimes just a spreadsheet, which is what we see an awful lot being used in terms of privacy impact assessments under GDPR. But this will be about, you'll go through the process and you'll need to identify, what is the impact on health, safety, or fundamental rights? Are you compliant with relevant harmonized legislation? So this would be particularly important in areas such as medical devices, or whether or not you're compliant with GDPR, for example, and so forth. What the scope of the application is. Have you done a conformity assessment or so forth? And you'll have to go through this process and identify, where you sit within this. Now, that means, for example, you could end up with identifying then where you run into a problem that brings you to that high risk level, and perhaps you can tweak your system, to get it to the point where you come back under medium. So there's quite a lot of flexibility within the system, but you do have to engage quite proactively on it.
Yeah, and I think that everything that's happening and all the conversations that's happened around the AI Act kind of bring to mind all the high-risk things, all the potential problems, put you more into the concern category. And, here in DC, we've been having a lot of conversations with people both influencing policy, and then also a lot of young professionals who are thinking about implementing and using some of these tools in their work. And, I'm really hearing two competing concerns. So the first is the concerns about the bad AI could do. Think elections, think, catastrophic problems, and paired with a recognition of the lack of deep understanding within the individuals and within other kind of decision makers in Washington. And so that's kind of one view. And then the second is this idea that we're not even hearing any of the good. We aren't talking about the positives of AI that are already happening out there, and what are to come. I think about things that just this week there was a group at Princeton who'd got a nuclear fusion breakthrough, something to do with kind of plasma instability. The idea that we could have boundless energy at some point due to large language models is wild. And I mentioned the Google DeepMind CEO interview earlier that gave me pause on some of the AGI stuff. But at the same time, he's saying that their AlphaFold breakthrough from a couple of years ago, we're just a couple years away from AI designed drugs being in clinical trials. And And that's really amazing when you think about that and you think about agriculture. And so there's all of these really positive stories out there. And I don't know that we're at the right balance. I mean, we should be concerned, but I don't know. What's your point of view? What do you think? Where do you land?
That story from Princeton, that blew my mind. I was really impressed with that. And I remember years ago talking at an event on energy, demands and energy into the future and so forth. And the whole question of fusion came up and some of the projects and the trials that are being conducted around the world and how it's such an important area for scientific research. Even though there are massive barriers to achieve this, the potential benefits are so huge that people are really kind of continuing to keep pushing on it. And although what we saw coming out of Princeton was not, the definitive, this unlocks it for us, it did show that, using AI, they were able to solve a problem, get over the hump of a particular issue that was holding back the advancement of the research in the space. And in many ways, it was what really struck me there was it was a great example of how AI is so different and so valuable in that we have a problem which we know what the problem is, but it's outside the capacity of a human, brain to react with the speed necessary to deal with the problem. But because AI can deal with such vast amounts of data and can move at blinding speeds much, much faster than we can, then it was able to be deployed to solve the problem successfully. And that's a really good example about the differences between an AI being deployed into a particular issue as opposed to a human being, in that the capacity to, process massive amounts of data so quickly is what really sets it apart. So it shows that from a scientific research perspective, there are, huge opportunities here about deployment of AI, and that's incredibly exciting as well,
Well, and you said something earlier about an effort to create digital twins and how that could help city planning, but also sort of climate change planning. So can you talk a little bit about that and what's going on there?
Oh, yeah. This is one of the ones I'm going to end up geeking out about this an awful lot, but it's so there was a project coming out of Bulgaria a couple of years ago which really caught my eye, and it was about developing a digital twin city. So they created this virtual city and then of Sofia, and this would set up sensors around the city and measure things like traffic and airflows and pollution and pollen movements and so forth. But it allows planners now to go in and through the digital version, through the virtual city, they can say, well, what happens if we develop up this part of the city? And if we create buildings of these dimensions, what does that do in terms of the airflow, the traffic flow, pollution, et cetera, and so forth? So before they break ground, they get to have a good understanding of what the potential implications are for the city as a living space. And I thought that was very, very interesting, a great way to use AI and a great tool for urban planners around the world. Since I've discovered, of course, is that this has been brought up to a much larger scale at a European level through a project called Destination Earth, and which has got a really great hashtag of Destiny, so DESTIN, and then a capital E, which I love. But they are taking the same concept of a virtual or a virtual city, but it's a digital twin for the entire Earth, and they're looking at things like climate patterns. They're looking at transport. They're looking at pollution. They're looking at how do you respond to meteorological disasters and so forth. And the idea is to allow policymakers to draw on this data, to use these twins to model out systems, to model out scenarios so that they can have more informed decisions. So again, coming back, I suppose, to much of what we talk about with all our clients at Penta about how the importance of data being given into discussions in terms of informing policy decisions. We're seeing this here, of course, with this project. A fascinating project. I encourage everybody to have a look at it. But like I said, it allows them to draw on this data in terms of their policy making so that they can make more informed decisions. It also will help them in terms of mapping out, best scenarios in terms of responses to emerging, meteorological issues or climate issues and so forth, or disasters, natural occurring disasters and so forth, and have better response times to save lives and be more efficient. So really fascinating deployment of AI and machine learning within that space. Incredibly ambitious project. It's only 2 years in at this stage, but they're moving through it quite quickly. They'll come to the end of the project development and full delivery by 2030, but we should start to see some of the aspects coming on sooner than that. Probably about 2026 is what they're anticipating, certainly around some of the meteorological aspects. We'll see them that soon. But again, this is a really exciting use of AI, which probably doesn't get as much coverage as you would hope it should.
Yeah, I agree. So when we think about this and we have these conversations, like, how are you? Have you landed on AI optimist, or are you like in the middle? Where are you?
I'm still, a friend of mine said to me, it's not about being the glass half full or glass half empty. You can always refill the glass, right? So
Ooh.
I'm definitely in that space that, we go up and down. But I actually think on the research and science side, some of the deployments of AI are extremely exciting and really encouraging. So I'm definitely on the optimist side, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Me too. But I have talked to a couple people who are not on the AI optimist side, particularly when it comes to elections. There's been all of this talk about the Indonesian elections and how one of the candidates had a more cuddly AI generated version of himself. And there was this discussion whether that was okay or not okay. And, my view on that was it was disclosed. It was AI generated. It was done by the campaign. I mean, how much of this is just a new version of using tools better, the way that, Barack Obama used Twitter and social media in really novel ways back in 2008. And then how much of this is a little bit scary. You had in the New Hampshire primary, you had a robocall, going out that had purported to be Joe Biden, and that's a little bit scary. That's not okay. What if there was one that told everyone that the election day had been moved? How do we think about that? Where do you come down on elections, as this is a very big election year across the globe?
It's such a huge one, but I think you're right. Like it's easy to be concerned, and in many cases because it's difficult to really understand what the potential impacts would be, or how would they be, or would we be able to determine them. Definitely, the buzzword, from an AI perspective in the AI Act rather, has been about transparency. So, for example, in that case, if the candidate wants to kind of use a filter or whatever the case is, or present themselves in a different light, if it's being declared this is generated by AI, well then, is that okay? Whereas if you have a situation where you've got people being deceived, willfully deceived through AI tools, that's a very different conversation. So, definitely a big area of concern. I think there's also, rightly or wrongly, I think there's a sort of a pessimism around this in terms of all the elections taking place, that people sort of anticipate this is going to happen. And that in itself, the fact that there is that pessimistic element about it, is a bit concerning.
Yeah, and that does lead me to a question. Like, there already is disinformation. There already is misinformation. I mean, you look at what happened in the Brazilian elections a few years ago. There was just kind of massive disinformation, and it was shared via WhatsApp by groups of people, and they ended up limiting the number of people that you could share with. So we've already had these problems. I get that Gen AI magnifies it, but is this more of a literacy question and helping people understand the difference? Or are we just in a different category of threat that we need to be thinking about? And I just don't know that I have a full view on that yet.
No, it's very difficult. And you mentioned WhatsApp, and I suppose there's a huge difference between closed systems like that, closed groups like that. How do you monitor? How do you manage that? How do you avoid the proliferation of false content through those private groups? It's almost impossible to do. So the content moderation side of things, or the content control side of things, is going to be very difficult. It is somewhat encouraging that we're seeing some leadership coming from some of the big tech companies in particular to say that they are going to address this, whether that's OpenAI, whether it's Meta. Do you mean they have made the point that they recognize the concern that they are going to take steps, but how effective that can be is yet to be seen.
So it sounds like we are cautiously pessimistic about elections and what could come out of those. And we'll be watching that very closely throughout the year. So more to come. But let's refill the glass quickly and go back to some of the positive elements. You mentioned something to me about common data spaces and how the EU is planning to kind of use different data sets for planning. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is something, again, when we look at the AI space and all the rest, and looking beyond just AI policy itself, there are so many other elements that it is dependent upon, whether that's infrastructure, connectivity, so forth. But also a key area is the data strategy from a European perspective. And one of the areas is a couple of aspects of this. There's a Data Governance Act and there's a Data Act and so forth. But one aspect they've gone into is a concept called data spaces. And the data spaces are part of a strategy where they've brought together initially 9 data spaces. So these are areas where what they're doing is they're bringing the data in from public sector and businesses to create a common data space, to create a common pool around these particular verticals. And then that allows companies and allows organizations who want to provide a service into Europe to come in and access these data spaces. So, for example, there is one on energy, there's one on mobility and so forth. So if you had a company that was coming in and wanted to work with self-driving cars, for example, and talk about solutions of autonomous vehicles in Europe, they could access, through an intermediary, they can access this pool of common data drawn from 27 member states about traffic patterns and so forth in Europe. And it means that they're not required to go to a third party, to another country, or to another company rather, to license that data, but rather Europe provides it through these common spaces. So it's very much about enabling companies to provide these services into Europe. Now, there's another aspect to this, which is probably worthy another discussion another day, which is that there's also an issue about data localization. So, for example, they don't want the data being taken outside Europe. Now, that's a whole other discussion about data localization and making sure the services provided in Europe is drawing upon European data and so forth. And it plays into kind of really continuing policy areas that we've seen under the e-privacy directive, and the e-privacy regulations being negotiated under GDPR, under the Data Act and so forth. There's a very clear message from Europe that the data has to stay in Europe. But again, they are looking to facilitate these areas, these common data spaces. And the ones they've started off with are health, industrial and manufacturing, agriculture, finance, mobility, the Green Deal, energy, public administration and skills. And again, around each of these areas, now they've added to them since with media and some others. So it's building out as we go. And there's a lot of work being done on it. And just a few months ago, they awarded a contract to a consortium of companies who will create the actual network and the infrastructure through which companies will be able to access these. But I think it's a very interesting approach. It's a very European approach. As I said, the data localization element is a key part of this. A lot of companies might say, well, it's in some way disadvantageous to US tech companies who hold a lot of this data. But again, that's a European approach, and that's how they've taken it. It's a key part of the strategy, and it's there to enable technologies under such as the AI Act to be deployed at a European level. But again, for me personally, I think it's a very interesting initiative and opens up a lot of opportunities for further growth in Europe.
Yeah. Well, I think we should end on the positive note of all of the investment and new ideas and creative thinking about how we can use all of this data that we have and allow an AI that has the ability to draw all these connections in a really powerful way to help guide us as we think about, the best policies and the best way forward. And so thank you again for such a great conversation, Chris, and to all of you listeners for listening to this month's episode of Artificially Intelligent Conversations. Remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts and follow us on LinkedIn at Penta Group.
Thank you very much.